So, do you want to play a game? Or go into the further? Or do you want to invite that kind spirit into your doll? One man is responsible for making us ponder all these questions, and that man is James Wan. Of course, when talking about him, we have to consider his longtime partner, Lee Wan-el, who helped to set off his career. But James Wan is the visionary who brought not one, not two, but three of the biggest horror franchises of the last 2 decades to our lives. Consider this, okay? Insidious, The Red Door, The Nun 2, and Saw X are all coming out this year. Imagine starting these franchises all over a decade ago, one of them almost 20 years ago, and they are still just as relevant as ever. Not to mention, he also has his Aquaman sequel coming out later this year too. With The Nun 2 just released and Saw X coming to us really soon, I thought what better time to do a deep dive of the one and only James Wan. The popular culture is demanding that we talk about this man. So first, we're very briefly going to go over the basic points of his life story. Where did he grow up? Where did he go to school? Then we will get into the deep dive of his entire directorial career, including a few movies that he's produced as well. To cap the video off, I will be ranking all of his directed work. If all of that sounds good to you and you're sitting there locked and loaded with all your drinks and your snacks, you're ready for this deep dive, then I'm also gonna need you to real quick just take a look at the subscribe button. Have you clicked it yet? Are you ready to devote your soul to the cult of haunted hippie and to me, your unholy ruler? Honestly, we are like the coolest cult in the whole world if there was an award for such a thing, because we don't brainwash people. We're more like just a little fun horror club. If I have convinced you already to swear your allegiance to me, then maybe also take a look at the like button and the notification bell. Make sure that those are both pushed too. That way you never miss our next meeting. With all of that taken care of, let's now get into the early life of James Wan. James Wan was born on February 27th in 1977 in Kuching, Sarawak, Malaysia. His family then moved to Perth, Australia when he was just 7 years old. As a young adult, he moved to Melbourne. There he attended the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology to secure his BA in media in 1999. That is a very special year for the cult because, yes, that is the year that I was born. Also the year of the Blair Witch Project, which I keep that on my body. That is also where he met Lee Wan-el, and the rest is history, really. They became friends and then partners, and then you kind of already know what happened in the early 2000s after they graduated. But before we can talk about Saw, there is actually one movie prior that we need to discuss. In 2000, he co-directed a film called Stygian with Shannon Young, but unluckily for us, we were probably never gonna see it. According to Screen Australia, Stygian involved a couple named Jamie and Melinda who accidentally become the bearers of a mystical talisman sought after by the evil Reaper's brother, and find themselves trapped in a gutter punk purgatory named Exile. Wan's future collaborator Lee Wan-el also appeared, reportedly playing an evil clown in the movie's hellish underworld. Stygian was screened in 2000 at the Melbourne Underground Film Festival, but seemingly hasn't been shown since. According to a Reddit post, co-director Young has stated it now only exists in his personal archives and he doesn't want to release it. Apparently, Wan and Young both felt strongly that the movie was severely lacking in execution, so James Wan actually considers Saw to be his first film. But the influence of Stygian seems like it's still being felt. I mean, there's a mystical talisman, which just kind of reminds me of all the creepy doll stuff that James Wan loves, like Annabelle, for example. Wan-el plays an evil clown, which that reminds me of Jigsaw, I guess. And they become trapped in a purgatory called Exile, which, hello, the further. But this film is impossible to find. I didn't even bother because I took a look at that Reddit post that was cited in that article, and it just seems like nobody's had any luck at all. So long story short, if anyone's interested, I actually got in touch with the co-director Shannon Young. He seems like a very cool guy, gave me some random trivia about the movie, but nothing substantial. I gave a gentleman's word not to spread any of that info, not sure why it's sensitive, but hey, since he asked nicely. But the gist of the matter is that yeah, that movie will likely remain lost. Outside of its limited release, it only exists in his personal archives and he doesn't want to release it. He's a cool dude and I respect his wishes, but I'm still gonna hope it's either gonna surface somewhere or he changes his mind. Believe me when I tell you I looked hard for this a while ago. I was on Russian sites, Polish sites, Australian film sites, Putlocker, YouTube, and everything in between. between. It seems like it was given a few screenings, maybe at a film festival, and that's it. No DVD, no VHS, nothing. People have already scoured the internet looking for a pirated copy, and I guess that doesn't even exist. I suppose because there is such little demand for it, or there was such little demand at the time because it was his first film. So maybe let's change that. I'm sitting here, I'm demanding it. Rise up with me, cult, and we will get the unreleased first James Wan film released to the world. No, I'm just kidding. Oh, slightly. I'm joking slightly, because I also actually have a short film that I directed in college that I'm like, yeah, that one's probably comfy cozy staying on my hard drive. So I get it, but now that he's so renowned, I feel like we kind of deserve it. It would be so educational to let audiences see his first film out of college versus where he is now. It's time to move on to probably the most important film of his career. Now, we're not getting super deep into this one today because I do have a Saw deep dive coming out very soon, and I've already done a deep dive on the Insidious franchise, and I plan to do one on the Conjuring franchise as well. So as far as behind the scenes goes, for this video, I'm more so going to be focusing on James himself, his attitude about his career at the time, his insights, and more so just focusing on the evolution of his career.
Saw really started from James and I wanting to make a film. James really badly wanted to direct. You know, I met him at film school and he used to make these little claymations. For myself, I was kind of interested in writing and directing and acting. And so eventually our problems sort of met in the middle. It was like, if we make our own film, I can play the lead and you can direct.
Lee was actually the one who initially had the idea of someone being told they have a year to live who just snaps. Hence, John Kramer was born, but then the script took 9 months to write, which actually ended up being a good thing. Because it took so long to tweak things and feel like they had a finished script, by the time they were ready to actually produce it, they had caught the attention of an American studio. But they had nothing, almost no savings, but they didn't want to go out empty-handed to meet these American producers. Because then that would mean that they'd be spending basically the rest of their money just to go over there and be told no. And so comes Saw, the short film. The short film is actually just a scene from the original script that they put to screen with all the money they had left, and apparently it was Lee Whannell's money. That way, when they were sending out scripts to people of interest for the project, they were able to send out these little DVDs with the short on it as well.
James had his book with all the graphics, talking about the script, talking about the project, how he wants to shoot it. Within 5 minutes, Greg and Oren had basically said, okay, well, we're doing it.
When you get a script and a DVD at the same time, you know, your inclination is to throw the DVD in and check it out. Well, I gotta tell you, I sat there and looked at that and went, whoa. I mean, it was so unbelievably out there and dark and interesting. I mean, I was sold from the minute I saw that DVD. I sent an email to the producers with one word, which was wow, exclamation mark. And they called me the next day and they said, do you want to meet the filmmakers? The director's here in town and he'd love to meet with you. And I was like, let's do it.
Sometimes it seems like our favorite directors stumbled their way into their career because of luck, kind of like Tim Burton, who just happened to get into an animation program because it just opened at Cal Arts and they needed the students, who then just happened to be there at the exact right time when the Disney apprenticeship program was also being formed, who then happened to meet all the right people to get him all the connections in the industry, right? That's not to say that he's also not brilliant, and you've seen his weird drawings and all the stuff he's made. My point is just that then you also have people like Lee Whannell and James Wan who took a gamble, really, put everything on the table, and then wrote up based on pure talent.
No, we had similar interests. James was talented and I was interested in being talented. So I shared in his life. He let me come into his world.
I don't think that Lee gets enough credit, not only for directing 3 stellar movies, but also for how much he set up James Wan for his career that boomed straight out of the gate. And they did Saw just 5 years out of film school. They were babies.
You know, I normally don't ask people this question, but I feel compelled to ask you, how old are you?
I'm 27. I look younger than I am.
When you walked in, you could have been 15.
Well, you know, actually, in one of my screenings, every time after I do my Q&A, when I walk up, people always turn to me and go, are you sure you're not 12?
I don't think I would have gone that far. Like, it's nice to look kind of young, but I would have been a little bit offended by that. It was like this one time, I turned 21 in 2020, so like during the pandemic. So this is the time we're all revisiting Twilight, right? You and I, we both did that. that. So then I went to go pick up some Natty Lights and was using my ID for, maybe the 4th or 5th time. And the guy at Rite Aid, without being able to see my face, mind you, because I'm wearing a mask, he goes, well, you look about 12. He was so fucking rude. If you're watching this, which I know you are, I hope that you're still so embarrassed. I pulled out my ID and he checked it and was just like, getting derailed, but I actually have a really good transition with this one. Speaking of being 12, guess who knew he wanted to be a filmmaker since he was 11? James Wan. A lot of the inspirations for his work actually came from the stuff he loved as a child.
I think the scariest films I saw were 2 films I saw at a very early age, Jaws and Poltergeist. These 2 films have scarred me for life. I'm really afraid of the ocean and sharks because of Jaws, and I'm really afraid of scary clown dolls because of Poltergeist. I saw Poltergeist at the age of 7, and ever since then, I've had this thing for creepy dolls. My main influence for this film was a guy called David Lynch. It was a film director called David Lynch, and I love his work, and I guess to a certain degree, when Lee and I were writing the script, we were trying to channel that spirit, that Lynchian spirit into the film. That, plus another director that I really admire, that I love, a horror director that I love. His name's Dario Argento. He's an Italian horror director. He's been described as the Italian Hitchcock.
Creepy dolls have indeed wormed their way into most of his horror films, including Saw. And fun fact, the doll that you saw in the short film is the one that he used in the feature as well. And he had built it himself, James Wan did. I want to get so much more into Saw, but that's the type of fun fact I should be saving for the deep dive. Let's just leave Saw with one of my favorite interview moments.
How do you see your future in this industry, considering that the film haven't opened but it's being well reviewed and all that? And
It depends. If it does really well, we'll have a future. If it doesn't do very well, then I hear there's an opening at the
Krispy
latest
Kreme. Yeah.
Krispy Kreme, yeah.
Guess they don't really have to worry about that anymore. I will be getting into the financial and critical success of Saw in the deep dive, don't worry. Just know it was very, very successful. However, despite Saw being a very successful risk that they took, because you never really know which ideas will actually catch on, James Wan actually took a pretty timid next step in his career, I would say. Sticking to dummies and dolls, his sophomore film was then Dead Silence, which came out in 2007. After his wife meets a grisly end, Jamie Ashen returns to their creepy hometown of Raven's Fair. Once there, he discovers the legend of Mary Shaw, a murdered ventriloquist whose eerie presence still looms over the town. As he desperately digs for answers, Jamie encounters the curse that took his wife's life and threatened his own.
Scary puppets are, we decided to give them their own movie. Seeing as Billy was, the puppet from Saw was so popular, James and I looked at each other and went, well, the real star of Saw was that puppet. Ventriloquism, to me, is something that's just not taken advantage of in horror films much. I myself am very surprised by the limited amount of ventriloquist horror films there are out there.
Honestly, I don't think there was a lack. I just don't think that there were enough eyes on Goosebumps. They don't say so, and maybe I'm reaching, I will admit that, but it seems like they were definitely inspired by Slappy from Goosebumps. Night of the Living Dummy, anyone. That book scared the bejesus of me as a kid, to the point where when I was a kid, I also was really scared to eventually watch the episode of the TV show. That book successfully scared so many of us that R.L. Stine did something very atypical and he wrote a sequel for it. And then he wrote another one. The 2015 movie also made Slappy the main antagonist. And then he wrote an 18-book Slappy World series. And guess who is now the face of the new Disney Plus Goosebumps series? The original book came out in 93, the TV episode came out in 96. I sense that James Wan or Lee Wanell had to have known about them, one or the other, and got some inspiration. Because look how similar the dummies are. I thought that they were the same at first. There are even more parallels because in Goosebumps, it's a children's toy, and in the beginning of Dead Silence, they wanted the dummy to come across really benign.
We wanted to create a doll that isn't just straight away outright scary. We wanted it to have like some malevolent quality. Like when you first look at it, you go, oh yeah, it's just like, like a nice
Could almost
doll.
be cute, you know?
Yeah, almost cute, right? But then leave them alone with yourself in a dark room and you start to think, is that thing malevolent?
All my tangents round out to a good place, don't they? As far as behind the scenes goes, there is not too much to get into, unfortunately. The complete opposite to Saw, as you'll see when we get into that deep dive. I think that they just didn't feel the same sense of financial security from this movie as they did with Saw, given that it likely didn't have quite the same excitement from the crew. Remember Carrie Elwes being so jazzed about not only the script, but the short film. Despite less interest from the crew, they still had a hell of a time with the auditioning process. process. They looked at a ton of people, whether that means dozens or hundreds, they didn't specify, but they felt that they were at a standstill until they expanded their search of actors to Broadway. That's where they found Judith Anna Roberts on the very first day. They needed someone who could command a stage and who could learn to throw their voice, and she was the first person who actually could suit those needs.
When the ventriloquist was with us, he was able to do the moves, do the things, do stuff, and be part of it. But the bonding that can happen in something like that is what's important. My relationship with this creature is what's really important. He's truly alive for me.
And this poor woman, she's currently 88, so she was 72 at the time of filming, going through a 4-hour makeup process most days to get herself all done up for the shoot. And I mean, they painted her teeth and everything. I just love that in horror, and maybe in the modern era, we actually have James Wan to thank for this, that people in their 60s and older get to be the star of the show. See Saw, see Dead Silence, see Insidious. You don't get that in many genres except for horror. Even most popular dramas that I could pull off the top of my head follow young people as they're kind of making their way into an understanding of the world. Anyway, I don't know if I could necessarily credit James Wan for this, but I do wonder if characters like John Kramer and Elise nudged studios in the direction of requels, bringing back our favorite final girls when they're worn by age instead of being the pretty little thing that they were in the original movies. I don't know, it's something to think about in my opinion, and something that I really appreciate about James Wan. Now, because of the success of Saw, I imagine they were given $20 million to make this movie. Still very mid-budget, nothing crazy, but I personally could not imagine being handed that much money for my sophomore project. Anyway, it released in the United States on March 16th of 2007, and during its theatrical run, it made $22.3 million. But because of the booming DVD market at the time, there was a little bit more financial security there. It generated over $17 million in DVD sales alone.
The DVD was a huge part of our business, of our revenue stream. Technology has just made that obsolete. The movies that we used to make, you could afford to not make all of your money when it played in the theater because you knew you had the DVD coming behind the release, and 6 months later you'd get a whole nother chunk. It would be like reopening the movie almost. And when that went away, that changed the type of movies that we could make.
Gone are those days, I suppose. Now we have Blu-rays, but I just feel like every time I go into Best Buy or Target, the Blu-ray and DVD shelves just get smaller and smaller and smaller. So now I guess the thing that they have their residual faith in is streaming purchases, like streaming rentals. I wonder if it's at all the same, because I really doubt that. Moving on to the reception of this film, this was not received well by audiences or critics or the filmmakers themselves. Obviously, Rotten Tomatoes audience score and critical score are both really bad, particularly the critical score at 20%. It does have a 2.7 on Letterboxd, and we've seen worse, but obviously not great. Audiences are just not the biggest fan of this one, but there's a small group of people that defend it as one of the underrated gems of Wan's career. But even Leigh Whannell himself, who again wrote the film, is not a fan. Now, I tried to look at the original blog post on Leigh Whannell's website, but I think that because maybe it's no longer in use, the website's kind of broken. So I had to take this excerpt from Wikipedia, but he wrote this in August of 2011. A blog post titled "Dead Silence: The Hellish Experience of Making a Bad Horror Film." After everything is said and done, I'm almost glad Dead Silence happened because it gave me an extreme coal-faced lesson in what not to do. It was like learning to swim by leaping off Niagara Falls. I only write scripts on spec now, which means that I write them in my own time without getting paid and then take them out to the world to see if anyone's interested. Never again will I enter the arranged marriage of selling a pitch. I have also become very gun-shy about working with studios. In the world of independent film, what you write ends up on screen. Plus, they don't have the money to bring in script doctors. Works fine for me. Who knows, maybe one day I will work with a studio again. Good thing to know as a writer if you need any advice, if you are someone who operates in a similar way to him. I'm sure that since then, since now he has so much more experience in the industry. That's also sort of another craft in and of itself that they've learned to hone. Being able to work with studios, take the criticism from script doctors from the studio, be able to kind of manage that. It's just so interesting learning their perspectives on their careers at the time, because obviously they would both go back to studio filmmaking, though James Wan sooner than Lee Wan-el, with his next film that came out the very same year, Death Sentence, in 2007. Nick Hume is on his way home from a hockey game with his son Brendan and stops for gasoline. Helplessly, he sees a street thug kill Brendan while robbing the station. Believing the justice system will fail him, Nick goes after the killer himself, setting off a war between him and the killer's older brother. Here is where we first diverge from the duo that is James Wan and Lee Wan-el. This was their first project that they didn't do together. To talk about this movie, we also have to talk about Death Wish. Brian Garfield wrote both Death Wish and Death Sentence and was never pleased with the original adaptation of Death Wish in 1974, nor did he like any of the sequels, but James Wan did. Wan had read the novels and became inspired by the original trilogy of movies. Garfield was impressed with James Wan, and so they decided to move forward with James Wan directing. James Wan also had a pretty funny reason for being attracted to this project that might be indicative of where his career would end up just a few years later.
I'm a big fan of American muscle cars. One of the things I wanted to do was have the muscle cars have the same kind of tattoo designs on them as the gang members have.
Lucky for him, in just a few years, he'll be directing Furious 7. Here he received the same budget for Dead Silence, which was $20 million, but this time he had to stretch it out to make an action thriller, and there's a lot of really impressive filmmaking in this. One of the most well-known and referenced scene of this movie is the completely practical one-shot of Kevin Bacon running through the parking garage. The behind the scenes are really fun to watch. They used cranes and they passed off the camera between a bunch of dudes. It took them 12 hours to get this shot. Poor Kevin Bacon, he had to consciously not run like an action hero, but like the office guy that he was playing. He also tried to do as many of his own stunts as possible, and the poor guy was having a rough shoot. Emotionally, shooting this was really hard for him because, as I mentioned in the synopsis, his character's son dies in the film and his family is constantly in danger.
Shaking it off on Friday is difficult because you know that you're going to have to get back into it on Monday. It affects your thoughts. It affects my dreams, you know. I feel a strong need to get back in touch with my family and, you know, see my kids and kind of reaffirm that they're okay. And, you know, because I'm spending all this time with, you know, feeling, you know, the opposite. And of course using them, which I have to use them for my own kind of sense memory sort of thing.
However, despite having to run up a garage for 12 hours straight and the mental toll that it took constantly worrying about his family, James Wan apparently made up for that. As is true for most of the directors that I've covered, it seems like everyone pretty much loves James Wan.
He handles it just fine. He's got a creative eye to him, and he's very easy to work with. And basically, as a director, he's very open. I mean, for me, he even allowed me to rewrite a scene.
Pretty cool that he got to work with movie star and Scream King Kevin Bacon, too. The last note that I want to make on the filmmaking is that you can see the breadcrumbs of his signature style that began in Saw. The flow and the editing of this moment in Death Sentence reminds me of the classic spinning shot in Saw with Shawnee Smith. A little bit Raimi-esque in the very experimental liberation of the camera, and unfortunately that style is not always super consistent in his work, but that is not the last time that we'll see that. Despite all that was positive here, it unfortunately was yet another box office bomb. On a budget of $20 million, it made just under $17 million worldwide, though it did end up making over $10 million in DVD sales, so it ended up making them some money after all. There's also a really interesting contrast between the critical and the audience ratings on this one. With 113 critical reviews, the consensus ended up at 20%. A nonsensical plot and an absurd amount of violence makes this revenge pick gratuitous and overwrought. That's interestingly what a lot of fans of this movie like about it. They love how stupid it is and Wan's commitment to that. It's rated at a 3.2 on Letterboxd, so it fares a lot better than Dead Silence. I feel like this review kind of summarizes people's love of the stupidity in this movie. I love how every gunshot just blows a massive hole into everything. Wan has a knack for elevating silly material, and this can be downright idiotic, but hell, just look at that one-take sequence at the parking garage. Appreciated the small dose of Goodman too. too. Yeah, John Goodman is in this. It's so funny. Roger Ebert himself also reviewed this movie. There's a courtroom scene of true surprise and suspense and some other effective moments, but basically this is a movie about a lot of people shooting at each other, and during the parts I liked, the action audience will probably go out to get popcorn or a tattoo or something. So spicy, sassy Ebert, love it. It's also, I think, the most forgotten film of James Wan's catalog. Actually, I take that back. Doggy Heaven is without a doubt the most forgotten piece of James Wan directed work. I covered it already in my Insidious deep dive, so I'm not going to get into that again today. The one thing that I will reiterate is that this is where he met the lovely Lynn Shay and worked with her for the first time. And you know what? I'll also reiterate that you should not watch this short film. Do you really want to see a dog sexually assaulting Lee Wanell? I sure didn't. So that being said, for the love of God, let's move on. After the unfortunate blip that was Doggy Heaven, James Wan then directed a little movie called Insidious. Did you notice Hollywood's perception of you changing after the success of Insidious? Definitely. Lee and I knew we were capable of more than Saw, but no one else did. It didn't help that I went off and made Dead Silence and Death Sentence, neither of which caught on commercially. With Insidious, we set out to prove that we're genuine horror fans who know how to make scary films in the PG-13 realm. Making a scary PG-13 movie is a badge of honor. We wanted people to take us seriously outside of these gory films we got pigeonholed for. Yes, I already did a deep dive of that franchise, but there were a few interview clips that I didn't show then that I want to now. At this time in their careers, I don't think that James Wan and Lee Wanell were super media trained yet, and I eat it up.
Whose body would you go for?
Scarlett Johansson.
I'd jump into Ryan Reynolds' body and then go fuck the shit out of James. And I'd be like, now who's fucking who, buddy? This is what you did to my script.
I mean, they're both just still so young at this point, I think in their early 30s. And it's not like Blumhouse is allocating any of the budget towards press training, not for these guys. Part of the beauty of the early days of Blumhouse is how much they valued unique voices. It reminds me of how A24 currently operates, where creatives get to work completely unfettered by studio involvement, or they seek out the most original voices and distribute their work. Blumhouse has hella fallen off in that regard, because what do we have to look forward to this year? The Exorcist Believer with the most generic looking trailer I've ever seen. I guess we have Five Nights at Freddy's. I'll hold out a little bit of hope for that one. But when was the last time that Blumhouse truly took an actual risk with a new voice? Anyways, for the last time, I implore you to watch that Insidious deep dive. Lots more fun interview moments in that one. So now we have to move on to The Conjuring because James Wan's career just moved like that. A franchise begun by James Wan in 2013 that has now grossed over $2 billion in the box office.
In terms of The Conjuring, after Insidious, I didn't really want to do another ghost story, haunted house, supernatural movie, right? I'm like, I already done it. I don't like kind of repeating myself if I cannot find something different to it. So when The Conjuring came along, I was like, oh man, it is the story about the Warrens. And I've been so fascinated with the Warrens for so long that I couldn't really turn it down.
This is one pattern you'll see throughout James's career. He does not want to be a one-trick pony. So I guess I should have seen this next comment coming, but it didn't really hurt any less when I heard it.
I don't just see myself as a horror filmmaker, you know, because I think that's so limiting to just do one thing. I'm a student of cinema, and I love filmmaking of all kinds. That's the one thing I don't like about being put in a box. I have worked pretty much since Saw to break out of that box. You know, I would hear someone like Wes Craven saying stuff like that, you know, how he would have such a hard time breaking out and doing all that stuff. And so I'm very mindful, you know, I'm learning from past masters of horrors, heed what they have to say. Conjuring and Insidious Chapter 2 are basically my last horror movies.
Ever? Or just at the moment? For this particular time?
You can never say ever.
It's just so weird to me that I think all of the directors we've covered besides Mike Flanagan are like, don't put me in a box. I'm not just a horror director. If it were me up there, if I had just directed Saw, Insidious, and The Conjuring, I'd be like, hell yeah, I'm the king of horror. You got that right. That is literally all I want to be. I want to be a horror director and maybe direct a few comedies here and there. Gay ones though, with lots of women. And I do get the sentiment that yeah, I don't want to be boxed in by outside perceptions of my work, but it's not like he doesn't get to make pretty much anything that he wants now. You don't hear filmmakers saying, I don't want to be pegged as a drama director or I don't want to be known as a comedy director, because those are the genres that are accepted, whereas horror is never really seen as a good thing, so it makes it harder for you to find other jobs. That's one reason why filmmakers who break out in horror tend to want to show that they can do other things than that. The business industry really, for some reason, has a perception that if a director is successful at horror, then they're only good at that. John Carpenter is actually pretty fortunate because he's been able to branch out and do action and sci-fi. I'll be happy to have his kind of diverse success. This was from an interview he did back in 2013, so he had really only done horror at that point besides Death Sentence, which was actually his most violent film ever. I love the tie-ins to the other directors that we've already covered, and luckily for James, he's been very successful in branching out from horror, but more on that later. I know that, again, I'm not really getting super into the behind the scenes of it all, but don't worry, a Conjuring deep dive will be coming your way the closer we get to the release of The Conjuring 4 and the new TV show. We're instead focusing on where he's at in his career, right? And at this point, not only is The Conjuring releasing in 2013, but so is Insidious 2. And interestingly, one of the reasons why he decided to direct Insidious 2 was because of his lack of involvement with the Saw franchise. The flack I got for Saw is why I wanted to direct Insidious 2. I didn't direct any of the Saw sequels, but people thought I did. When Insidious 2 came along, I said if anyone's gonna fuck up my franchise, it might as well be me. The Saw sequels went in a direction I wouldn't have gone in. With Insidious 2, I wanted to push a potential franchise in the direction I thought that it should go in. This is interesting to me because I actually consider Saw 2 to be one of the strongest horror sequels ever made. Maybe he's talking about the following installments as the franchise kept going on. I don't know, but I love that franchise. Sorry there's so much overlap with The Conjuring and Insidious 2, but that's just where he was at in his career. And speaking of, it doesn't seem like this was getting to his head at all.
I realized how I could speak to you. You weren't somebody way, way, way up here. That you were a down-to-earth person that I could explain things to.
We love to hear that. We love a down-to-earth director who does not let success affect his humility. Also, sidebar, this interview was so weird because I don't think that Lorraine Warren was all there in all her life, not just in her old age. The interviewer would ask very simple and succinct questions, and she just could not answer them. Yes, I'm also a skeptic, and I might do a deep dive on Ed and Lorraine Warren at some point because they've got some nasty skeletons in their closet that nobody talks about. That was supposed to be a serious sentence, but then I started saying nasty.
We didn't just phone it in with this film. For me anyway, I grew up loving all the classic horror movies that were made by the studio back in the 70s, and so it would be amazing to just see people loving studio horror films again. And so, you know, it starts with, us as filmmakers, giving quality genre films back to the public.
I had not considered that. I never knew that James Wan was such an advocate for studio horror. He did say at one point that The Conjuring was his opportunity to do Insidious with a studio budget. So that's probably what he wanted to do all along. The success of The Conjuring and Insidious is no doubt what led to him being handed the keys to the Fast and Furious franchise. That's right, quite a leap we're making from horror to an action franchise that I truly don't know if it's supposed to be a self-parody or not with Furious 7. After defeating international terrorist Owen Shaw, Dominic Toretto, Brian O'Connor, and the rest of the crew have separated to return to more normal lives. However, Deckard Shaw, Owen's older brother, is thirsty for revenge. A slick government agent offers to help Dom and company take care of Shaw in exchange for their help in rescuing a kidnapped computer hacker who has developed a powerful surveillance program. Look, I'm not gonna act like I watched the entire Fast and Furious franchise leading up to this movie because I just didn't do that. That task did not resonate with my spirit. That felt like it would have been a waste of time. I almost didn't watch Furious 7, but I was like, Kylie, you have to do it. You need to be able to draw parallels to his other work. You need to understand what he's talking about in his interviews. And while these movies are so goofy, I did learn a lot about his filmmaking.
One of the things I tried to do is,
I want to try and honor all the great things that the previous filmmakers have done before me, and sort of keep it in the same tone, keep it sort of in the same world, but try and bring some of the visual stamps, the some of the visual stuff that I love aesthetically, that is inherently to me and to my filmmaking. And for example, the kind of stuff I like to play with is have fun with the camera work, and I did bring some of that cool camera work into this, and wanting to bring what I love from my thriller genre background, which is suspense. I love to bring suspense and tension into a lot of the set pieces here as much as I possibly could.
Use playful camera work he did, and I'm so glad that he brought that up. From what I recall, this movie doesn't have any of those classic experimental spinning shots like we see in Saw, but it does have very involved camera work during the action. I think that one was built for both action and horror because to me those genres demand the closest relationship between the director and the camera. I get that with dramas too, but usually those movies are a lot more static. In horror and action, you really need to know how to move the camera, otherwise so much can get lost that you don't want to go to waste. Like these fight scenes, for example, you can really see the care that went into the blocking, and yet it still feels very natural. Sometimes with action movies that are maybe a little lower budget, I'm like, I can't see what's going on. James Wan is masterful at knowing exactly what to put on screen. The horror thriller genre is no different from the action genre. It's about understanding the beats to your scene. I want my action scenes in Fast and Furious 7 to have audiences on the edge of their seats as opposed to just going along for the ride. One of my favorite action movies is Die Hard. It has big action scenes that are so grounded and scary you feel for the characters. When John McClane jumps off the roof at the end, it's frightening. That's what I want to bring to Fast and Furious.
What I learned in the sort of low budget world where I came from is how to be creative, like how to be creative with my shots, and how to find ways around things if things are not working. And even though this is a much bigger movie and I can pretty much have whatever I want in it, but I still think it's great to not lose sight of what makes you a filmmaker. And I think it's important as an artist to be to be as creative as you could, with the way you design your shots and your scenes.
And like we just discussed with his camera work, clearly he didn't lose sight of what was important. I think that's the mark of a true artist, because you can have all the money in the world and still make Ant-Man and the Wasp Quantumania, you know what I mean? Now, one last thing we have to discuss is obviously the passing of Paul Walker. In case you were unaware of this is from a Guardian article written in 2014. Paul Walker, the star of the Fast and Furious film franchise, died after the car he was in crashed at a speed of more than 100 miles per hour and burst into flames, according to the coroner's report released on Friday. Walker was found dead along with his friend and financial advisor Roger Rodas on November 30th in a burnt-out Porsche Carrera GT in Los Angeles. The coroner's report said Walker died of the combined effects of traumatic and thermal injuries, while Rodas, the driver, died of multiple traumatic injuries. No drugs or alcohol were detected in either man. Very tragic and untimely passing, and he also happened to pass before they finished filming Furious 7.
I didn't so much question our ability to finish it from a practical standpoint, but I did question it in terms of coming from an emotional level, whether or not if this is something that we could all continue, deep down inside of all of us. Basically what we all kind of realized was that we had to finish this film. There was no way we were not going to finish this movie. We had to finish this movie for Paul, and to really honor his legacy, to honor the great guy that he is, and to and let this be the last movie that he makes. And so we wanted the fans out there to get the opportunity to say goodbye to him one last time.
I mean, I think James Wan is just a class act through and through. So they were able to complete the film. It then released in April of 2015. With a budget of around $200 million, it's reported differently on different websites. The movie went on to make over $1.5 billion. If you take a look at this graphic, it shows you how much money he's made when he was a producer, when he was a director, etc. You can see that he's made about $3.7 billion over the course of his career in the stuff that he's directed. More than half of that came from Furious 7. That just blows my mind. His most financially successful film to date, and the critics were also more or less on board. Received an 81% from critics and 82% from audience members, making it also his second highest rated film, just behind The Conjuring, which received an 86%. It also has a 3.2 on Letterboxd, which I feel like anything above a 3.1 is pretty impressive, especially for a movie where that many people have seen it. Overall, just a massive success for this pivot in his career, which makes it all the more surprising that after this, he returned to horror. Along with this, I do just really briefly want to touch on his hefty producing career. I'll get more into it once we cover the modern era of his career, but at this time, he was producing a movie called Lights Out. You may remember this introduced us to Diana, an entity that shows up in darkness, but if you keep the light on, she can't get you, based on the extremely viral YouTube short directed by David Sandberg. I just thought that this would be nice to throw in to show you yet another very positive aspect of the way that James Wan works.
As a producer, myself and Lawrence, one of the things that we tried to do is give David the freedom to be able to shoot the movie that he wants to make. And for myself, having a bit of experience in the horror genre, I try to just kind of steer him in the right direction, give him all the guidance he needs. But at the end of the day, it is his movie, and we just want to support his vision for it. And I think he did a terrific job.
As a director himself, I think that when he's producing, he understands and can anticipate the needs of his directors really well. I realize that whatever horror movie I attach my name to, I want it to be something that in my earlier days I would have loved to direct. I need to be passionate about these projects as a filmmaker and not have it be just about the money. It's exciting to get the chance to produce other horror films. Ideally, I'd love to do what Sam Raimi does. He went off and created Ghost House Pictures so he can still get new horror movies out there and then direct movies like Oz the Great and Powerful, which isn't horror at all. And it's a wonder that he does not get lost in all of this, because if you just take a look at his Wikipedia page where everything he's done is listed out for you, it's mind-blowing. We are frankly only scratching the surface with his directorial career. Which, getting back to that, let's briefly discuss The Conjuring 2. This was his return to horror after he thought that The Conjuring and Insidious 2 would be his last horror movies. It's funny to me, it is, because it took him less than 3 years to come back to the genre.
At the end of the day, I didn't really see myself as coming back to horror. I came back to a story that I'm really passionate about. I came back to the people that I love to work with. Patrick Wilson, Vera Farmiga. I came back to the set of producers that I had such a great time working with, and New Line, Warner Brothers. Going away to do Fast and Furious 7, that was fun and all, that was cool, but it was someone else's franchise. And so there's that pride of ownership that I created this. And so the opportunity to come back and expand on that world was, to me, the most enticing thing.
As I mentioned earlier, he will only direct a project if it feels like it's really something he hasn't done before, and believe it or not, this movie does qualify. While everyone obsessed over the Amityville haunting, he was equally as interested with a case that was happening across the pond. The setting was also completely different, where in the first Conjuring movie, the family was very isolated. The second movie is a much more suburban setting, where they could actually run to the neighbors for help, but, a lot of good that did them. Also, he just adores working with Patrick and Vera.
Going off to do Fast and Furious 7, I kind of did rejuvenate my love for this particular genre, and that was the thing, after having made, Conjuring 1 and Insidious 1 and 2 as well, all back-to-back, all 3 films, I just got a bit tired of it, and actually taking a break to go off actually helped me a lot, and I love painting on such a big palette like I had on F7, and that was such a fast-paced, such an awesome action world to play in. I did kind of miss a little bit of the sort of the slower, more controlled world of my thrillers. The idea of coming back to work with Vera Farmiga and Patrick Wilson was what clenched it for me.
This was all still in an effort to bring back the respect to studio-made horror films, which at that time I think he definitely accomplished. I am going to mention some behind-the-scenes stuff here because this is a parallel that I want to draw later on about his later movies.
I like the house to feel as real as possible, and because what that does is it gives me the freedom to follow actors from room to room without cutting it up, and I think that style of filmmaking is very important to the way I construct my scares, my set pieces, and so by the very nature of that, I told my production designer very early on that we need to, literally build a 2-story house.
So for both the first and second Conjuring movies, they fully built the houses that they wanted to shoot in. And for The Conjuring 2, they completely rebuilt that neighborhood, but in the States. That's an aspect of filmmaking that I feel like is just a little bit lost these days. That's a very classic way of filmmaking, even if you think back to like the 1950s when when they first really started using sound and sound stages. They built everything, having complete control of the environment, like James did, building entire houses for your set. Having the forethought to think of how to manipulate the environment to the camera's needs instead of vice versa, I'm into it. And that is not the last time you'll see this in his filmography. But for now, let's talk about the last movie in his action era, Aquaman. His first 3D movie and only his 9th feature overall. Once home to the most advanced civilization on Earth, the city of Atlantis is now an underwater kingdom ruled by the power-hungry King Orm. With a vast army at his disposal, Orm plans to conquer the remaining oceanic people and then the surface world. Standing in his way is Aquaman, Orm's half-human, half-Atlantean brother and true heir to the throne. With help from his royal counselor, Aquaman must retrieve the legendary trident of Atlan and embrace his destiny as protector of the deep.
So I knew that they were obviously doing Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, Flash, and Aquaman, and eventually, obviously, building up to the Justice League film. I spoke with like the heads of Warner Brothers. I think it was during maybe Conjuring 1, to the premiere of Conjuring 1, and I said, hey, I'm pretty big fan of superhero movies, and I love superhero comic books in general when I was growing up, so if you guys are interested, I might be interested.
Maybe I should just start putting myself out there, right? Yo, I'm Kylie. To whoever's listening out there, can I please direct a Hellraiser movie? Thank you. The stark difference between myself and James Wan at this point is that he had already made about $1 billion for Warner Bros. Not only that, but the final film is pretty much exactly what he pitched because the character had no cinematic history before that. Another thing that excited him was that he loved comic books growing up, and he had always wanted to make a world creation film. In my mind, he kind of did that already with Insidious and The Further, but this is a pretty big step up from that, creating an entire underwater nation. However, just because he was taking on something entirely new, it doesn't mean that we don't get all that classic James Wan filmmaking. Here we can see similar kinetic camera movements that are obviously different to the types of shots we saw in Saw, but this oneer really does still remind me of that classic spinning shot, just here Wan had probably the entire budget of Saw for this single scene.
Just to give you guys a concept of what we did for that sequence is, we built the set. It's really a four-wall set. No ceiling because the whole thing was sort of programmed on a spider cam. So the camera basically was all pre-programmed to sort of zip from one side to another side, wrap around the actors, fly to this side, fly back to that side. So you can imagine just trying to time the action, and the camera would, it's supposed to stop sort of like inches from your face.
Again, I have to stress, he didn't have to do this. Some creatives completely lose their sight when they're handed an infinite budget. James Wan is like, nah, let me give myself hell directing a very complex oneer. But he was taking care of himself as he had to for this project. It was bigger than Furious 7 even, because in this movie, practically every shot involved VFX, and it consumed 2.5 years of his life. All of this grueling work happened on top of producing The Conjuring 3, The Nun, and The Curse of La Llorona. Despite being stretched so thin, he delivered another commercial banger. It now sits at just 3rd for Warner Brothers, coming in only behind Barbie and Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2. His second film to make over $1 billion, capital B. Though for that film, he always had 100% of the studio's support, and that was further backed up by the test screenings.
We had a really good test screening. We had a few such small ones where you would show kind of friends and just sort of a few sort of recruited people. But then when we did the big massive test screening, it was the highest testing DC film. DCEU film, let me correct myself there. I want to say this test screening has saved my career time and time again. On other projects when, whether it's the studio, the producer's like, maybe we should change this, change that. The test screening audience tell them, no, that's not the right way to do it. Saw was supposed to go straight to video at the very start. At the test screening, the audience stood up at the end and screamed at the screen. And that just made Lionsgate go, okay, maybe this is not a video movie.
I love how kind of despite wanting to get away from his horror king status, he still recognizes his roots at every step of his career. He's constantly mentioning Saw and what he's known for. He even compares Aquaman directly to horror films.
I think, this movie was designed to be a crowd pleaser, and so it's a fun one to watch with an audience, just like my horror films are. I make my movies for sort of like the big communal crowd, and I really think it's how it needed to be enjoyed.
It makes even more sense to me now why he would say in other interviews that he wanted to make the ocean very scary in this film. That he wanted to capture the magical qualities of it, but also the horrors of it. This also includes touching on the environmentalism aspect of it, and big ups to James Wan for kind of Trojan horsing a pro-environmentalist message into this movie. It includes all the horrifying monsters we get to see in the movie as well, including the very fearsome Kraken, or whatever it is, voiced by Julie Andrews of all people, which James Wan totally geeked out about directing her, by the way. It was super cute. Despite directing icons like Julie Andrews, Nicole Kidman, Willem Dafoe, he remains remarkably humble.
This is going to be a big hit. I know it. You're going to be involved, I'm sure, in a sequel. Have you already thought?
What sequel? Don't talk to me about sequel. This movie hasn't even come out yet.
It's going to be a big hit.
This moment's really funny in retrospect because he's been in hell, like in the actual clutches of Satan himself, trying to get that sequel made, but more on that later. Unfortunately, we now must move on to the final era of his career, but to me the most exciting. Yes, the Reinvention era, it's finally time to discuss the one and only Malignant, James Wan's huge splash back into the horror genre. Paralyzed by fear from shocking visions, a woman's torment worsens as she discovers her waking dreams are terrifying realities. Now, I regret to inform you, actually I don't, that you have to watch Malignant if you haven't seen it. We need to get into spoilers in this video, and it's best if you go into that movie completely blind. I promise, even if you don't like it, it's gonna rock your socks off with all these weird twists and turns. So if you haven't seen it yet, then shoo, go on. I'll still be here. I'll be here waiting for you when you get back. I think all of us horror fans were really excited for him to return, both kind of him returning to form while doing something super brand new.
There was a part of me that just wanted to go back, hark back to my old school style of filmmaking, which was trying to do as much of it in camera as I can. So you do use a lot of practical makeup effects, do a lot of in-camera stunts. That's the kind of filmmaking that I love. I miss it, and haven't done that in a while. And so with this movie, it really was an excuse to just find a project that really let me go back and just kind of go crazy with the practical effects, to really have fun with like all the blood and gore and
I'm so happy that every time this man thinks that he's done with horror, he's just wrong. Amazingly, we almost have Aquaman to thank for this movie existing. However, it earns no thanks for its inspiration, which actually came from night terrors. If you're unaware, night terrors are basically nightmares that a person cannot wake up from, and this leads to them maybe screaming or thrashing in their sleep or a whole host of other symptoms. They ran with this concept because in the behind the scenes, James Wan talks about how he feels like audiences are starved for something new. He also said that he made this movie for the horror fan inside of himself, which just lets me know that I don't think he's ever really gonna be done making horror movies. But this was no easy feat given how smart audiences are these days.
It is a very windy story, I mean, obviously a lot of it is just me holding my hands, holding the cards, in my hands and trying not to show it, just kind of like trying to find degrees of how much we show and how much we don't show, right? And it's difficult because today's audiences are very savvy, they're very clever, they look at trailers and they can kind of look at posters and they can kind of put things together, right? So the key is like, how do I stay ahead of audiences today that are so savvy, but at the same time, still coming up with things that people haven't quite seen before.
So what he did to hold his cards was to start with a more familiar foundation. So for example, the beginning of Malignant is more of a murder mystery, which then devolves into something paranormal, ? She has a psychic link to this killer because he attacked her when she was a child. Then the absolute bomb drops that he's a parasitic twin in the back of her head. I mean, the crowd went wild. Gabriel is such a marvel, in my opinion. He was done entirely practically with handcrafted animatronics and prosthetics. They also had two contortionists that played him, a woman and a man, so that they could switch it up to feel more like it's Maddie or Gabriel. We don't get a lot of super practical horror like that these days.
It really is a living tribute to the 80s horror films where they had no problems just embracing the blood and guts of those genres and just kind of going to town and crazy with it.
I just love how much he's played in the genre. Saw was much more of a drama thriller. Insidious and The Conjuring are obviously very paranormal. And here with Malignant reinventing himself yet again, we get this beautiful homage to 80s body horror and giallo. And remember how I mentioned the practical sets for The Conjuring? So they did the same thing for this movie. The set was like a dollhouse for the one shot of her running through the house, and the camera was on this big wire. I love how he takes the tricks that he learned from his previous movies and uses them in current ones, but kind of switches them up to be something fresh. Another great example is, remember the oneer in Aquaman where they had to program it really specifically and the stunt people had to be super careful so that they would hit their marks and not get bodied by the camera? You can see they did the same thing for the huge action sequence in the police station with this giant robotic camera arm. This was no cheap task though. This movie had a budget of $40 million, which all things considered is still a mid-budget film. That is the same budget he had for The Conjuring 2, for example. But unfortunately, it only had a worldwide gross of $34.9 million. Surprisingly, the critical score is so much higher at a 76% with an audience score of 52%. Although Malignant isn't particularly scary, director James Wan's return to horror contains plenty of gory thrills and a memorably bonkers twist. Love it or hate it, and there isn't much in between, Malignant is one horror movie that takes risks and is willing to get weird. The audience review is right on. It's such a divisive movie, I think because it is too weird for Wan's typical audience members. You know, the common folk that probably don't watch this channel. People that maybe watch the Conjuring movies, but those are the only horror movies that they'll watch at the theater. Because when they watch Malignant, I would just imagine they'd be like, what the hell did I just watch? And then there's us, the freaks. No, I mean, the people who like it are just people who enjoy feeling like they're stepping onto a roller coaster when they walk into the theater. People who love camp. And you have to be alright with body horror. Like, this movie's made for a pretty specific crowd. With this one, I admit I was very curious what the more uppity critics would have to say about this one. So we unfortunately have to take a look at Roger Ebert's website and read a review written by Simon Abrams, who just never has anything good to say about horror movies. I also definitely have beef with him in my own mind because he doesn't know I exist, but he just writes the most needlessly sassy stuff about horror movies, so we're just gonna look at a few quotes in here. Flickering television and phone screens, unexpected faces reflected in glass surfaces, and gaunt wraiths who all seem to shop at Hot Topic. These are fine enough elements for a horror movie, but not when they're built up to such a laughable degree and without much visual flair or distinction. Almost every set piece or kill feels anticlimactic. I think it's funny that he says they're built up to a laughable degree because that was really the point of the first act of Malignant. It's him sort of parodying even himself. The first time that I watched Malignant, I was disappointed with the first act because I was thinking, oh, he's just retreading the stuff he's done for Insidious and The Conjuring. Upon my second viewing, I was like, oh, this is camp. Oh, he's trying it. So I thought it was funny that he said he was building him up to a laughable degree because it's supposed to be funny. Are we maybe not a fan of camp, Simon? I have to give people shit in these circumstances because I don't know, it gets under my skin. I feel like it is kind of harmful the way that some people review horror movies. The very fact that he uses sort of the laughable nature of the movie as a criticism just kind of makes me read it as like, okay, well, did the campiness go over your head? Did you not take a moment to actually like consider the intentions of the filmmaker? Like, you know, what's going on? I mean, ever seen a giallo? No parallels for you to draw there? Like, come on. It just sucks that even in 2021, when this came out, it seems like a lot of critics are still in the same place they've always been with horror. And James Wan, king of the horror genre, who has managed to also be very successful in branching out from the genre, still gets this kind of criticism and still kind of gets written off without his movie being properly examined, in my opinion. So anyways, that's all I have for you with Malignant. Now, the last thing that I want to cover before I rank his career is getting into his upcoming projects. He has a new movie coming out in just a few months, Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom. And like I briefly mentioned earlier, it has been hell making that movie. It's coming out December 20th, 2023, but for a while, people didn't think we'd see this movie for a long time. Because first of all, it was initially supposed to release on December 16th of 2022, but then for unknown reasons to the public at the time, it was moved up to March 17th of 2023. Then it was moved up to Christmas Day of this year, and then recently shuffled up a week to December 20th. So I tried to get to the bottom of what was going on there. What has James been up to these these past few years. At the DC Fandom panel in August 2020, he stated, "The second one is a little bit more serious, a little more relevant to the world we're living in today. That's where it wants to go." But then a year later, in August of 2021, he said, "I've had to make adjustments all along the way. The DCU has been through lots of different versions, and one of the things that was challenging about this was keeping track of what's going on. Fortunately, the Aquaman universe is pretty far removed from the rest of the world. We're going to many different underwater kingdoms that are not necessarily related to what's happening with the other movies and characters, so we're standalone in that respect. So I can just tell my story on its own without being affected too much, but at the same time, I have to be mindful of what's happening." And dude, I feel so bad for him. The DC universe has been such a mess, and finally things might be starting to settle with James Gunn and Peter Safran taking over. They've gone through a very unusual 3 reshoots since this movie initially wrapped in January of 2022. The movie was in the middle of post-production and beginning test screenings that summer. While a timeline is not clear, from summer 2022 to the beginning of 2023, The Lost Kingdom underwent 2 rounds of reshoots and held several uninspiring test screenings. Batman was another issue all on his own, with the old studio head wanting Michael Keaton to kind of be like the Nick Fury of the DC universe. But then the release date changed, so they brought in Ben Affleck to do a round of reshoots in summer of 2022 to replace all of Michael Keaton's scenes. But then the movie got moved again to Christmas Day, and this would be after The Flash, which, if you didn't know, Michael Keaton has a cameo in that movie. So finally, when the new studio heads came in, James Gunn and Peter Safran, they decided to just cut Batman altogether because they were like, this is getting way too sloppy. And some of the chaos may not have been the studio's or filmmakers' fault. Some of the calendar moves were due to overloaded visual effects houses, a phenomenon that occurred during the pandemic and that affected both Flash and Lost Kingdom, causing a cascade of release date pushes. This is why unions exist, and all my love and support to all the VFX workers that are struggling to unionize right now. It actually looks like it's going well, so I wish you all the luck. You deserve so much better than this, and it's almost laughable the way that The Hollywood Reporter reports on things like this. It might not be the studio's or filmmakers' fault, it's the overloaded VFX houses, and it was a phenomena caused by the pandemic. As if it's not the greedy corporate studio pigs that overloaded the VFX houses in the first place. Yeah, in the pandemic, there was a boom, a surge in the need for people chilling at home to have entertainment. So the studio heads were acting on that. Don't act like it's the VFX house's fault. Ooh, I'm gonna get you, Hollywood Reporter. It's unclear how Safran's transition shifted the movie's fortunes, if at all. Insiders say that the filmmakers were in the dumps over the seemingly never-ending post-production process and waterlogged test scores. However, the skies may have cleared with the new reshoots. Gunn is said to have weighed in on the most recent cut, and the leadership approved a 5-day shoot. Sources say the shoot went so well that Wan and company completed what they needed in only 4. Poor James Wan. He has just been put through the ringer with this latest film of his, and the Hollywood Reporter is like, yeah, he was in the dumps. And I'm like, all of that for the movie to potentially flop like The Flash did? People don't know what's going on with DC. They don't know which storylines that they should still feel invested in. They don't know which characters are gonna get axed soon. Like, they don't know if there's gonna be a clean slate in the next year. And our beloved has been caught in the crossfire. Poor James Wan. But there is some positive news with his career concerning horror, so we can get into that. This isn't news, but just on a personal selfish note, maybe this will push him back more towards independent filmmaking because of just this mess that Warner Bros. Has put him through. But anyway, at the very least, we do know that his production company Atomic Monster has now merged with Blumhouse. So he definitely won't stop producing horror movies anytime soon, especially with Megan being their first release as a joint company, and the success that saw was just insane. But other upcoming movies that he is producing are Megan 2.0, of course, Night Swim, Salem's Lot, and Mortal Kombat 2. Stays booked and busy, that one. So interested to see what that man will direct next. Is he gonna remain in the death grip of DC, or is he gonna go back to horror? Kind of seems like within the last decade or so, he's had this really good thing going where he bounces back and forth. So we'll just have to see. But with that concludes the deep dive of his career. It's now time to rank the movies of James Wan. We're gonna stick to his feature films this time, so we are gonna cast aside the Saw short as well as Doggy Heaven. Doggy Heaven would have been at the bottom anyways, and Saw was made for basically nothing, so not really a fair comparison. That leaves us with just 10 feature-length films, all of them theatrical releases, mind you, except for Stygian, although, well, no, it probably did release in a theater at the festival where it was, but anyways. Disclaimer, I am ranking these based on their rewatchability more so than anything else, and also their subjective entertainment value. I'm not claiming any type of critical superiority here, okay? This is just based on my enjoyment. Coming in at number 10 would be Furious 7. Maybe not entirely fair because it is the only movie of the franchise that I have ever seen, but I think that I've seen enough to know that those movies are not for me. It was giving action movie for boomers who love Hallmark rom-coms. It was giving comedy written for people who still think it's funny when people say things like, yeah, cause that's not creepy at all. Just really low-hanging fruit, bad acting, kind of unbearably cheesy. It's not for me. I'm also inclined to not blame James Wan for that. I feel like that's probably just how the franchise rolls. Yeah, that pun was intended. Get over it. I don't think it's James Wan's fault that those actors were being so cheesy with each other, because you've seen the connection between Patrick Wilson and Vera Farmiga, or him and Rose Byrne too. So anyway, moving on to number 9, we have Death Sentence. Kevin Bacon, I love ya. Also excellent direction here by James Wan, but the script, oh, big woof. I love the first act. It was very gritty and serious and depressing. Then they kind of flip a 180 on the tone of the movie, like the review that I read from a fan earlier. It's, you know, James Wan is good at making things stupid and making them fun, which I would have had fun with that if that was consistent throughout. I was disappointed because I thought that I was getting a really dark thriller from James Wan, and then he just didn't commit to that. And maybe it's just the fact that that was so early on in his career and maybe didn't have the confidence to try to pull off just like a deeply serious thriller, but regardless, that is what it is. At number 8, we have Dead Silence, which I actually would predict that I think that I'll enjoy it more upon each rewatch. I've only seen it twice, but it had a decent leap for me in terms of the entertainment value the second time around. The positives are definitely the atmosphere for one thing. It really has that early 2000s very kind of gritty feeling to it, plus a lot of practical gore, and I found the story to be really interesting. I love urban legends, and Mary Shaw is a really cool villain, but something about the execution is just so off to me. I don't know if it's because all the rest of the characters are so forgettable. I couldn't tell you a single name of another character besides Mary, and also large chunks of the movie just fall out of my head, which is the exact opposite of some of his other work. Getting into the movies that I really like, even love, starting at number 7, we have Aquaman. This movie is beyond stupid. Some of the effects look so bad. Tonally, it feels like 4 different movies. At one point, you almost feel like you're watching Mamma Mia, but the actors are so damn charming, and some of the dialogue is hilarious, even when it's not trying to be. People jump out of planes without parachutes. Amber Heard eats flowers, and the wigs. Oh, honey, the wigs. I have a pretty good time watching Aquaman in his jeans, in his wet jeans, and no shirt, just fucking people up. Now, at number 6, we have The Conjuring, which I am just gonna go ahead and assume that's probably higher on the rest of your lists. I do not like possession movies, and to me, this is an exorcism movie that is masquerading as a haunted house movie. I love the vibes. I love the muted colors. I think that everyone in the cast delivers really great performances, but I do not like the types of scares that we get. I don't really like a lot of the jump scares in this movie. I don't like the, oh, levitation and loud noises are scary, because the story is just too weak. It's just a movie about a woman getting possessed, and I don't really find that interesting. So maybe you could see my number 5 coming, but at number 5, I do have The Conjuring 2, but I actually love The Conjuring 2. It is Valak's best movie by a mile. Some of the Billy Wilkins stuff still gets under my skin, and it's because I think that there's much more of a variety to the types of scares in this movie, and I actually don't mind the really loud and destructive climax because they used Valak so sparingly up until that point. This is also the best Ed and Lorraine movie by a mile. I mean, he's singing Elvis Presley, she's having visions of his death. It's sweet. I also like the focus on Janet. Her acting is so good. She comes off so vulnerable. The first Conjuring has much more of an ensemble kind of vibe, but in Conjuring 2, Janet is carrying. The only thing that holds this one back is some of the scares. Like, I love the concept of the Crooked Man. I love the look of him, but I don't think he was used well in The Conjuring 2. The scene where the dog turns into the Crooked Man with VFX, it takes me out. It's so bad. And like I said, it just has some of those other kind of 2010s jump scares that only really work in theaters. So that does kind of hold this one back for me a little bit. But at number 4, we have Saw, which I really grappled with the placement of it here on this list. Because when it comes to what I want to rewatch the most often, it's not Saw. Part of that is because I like to watch the Saw franchise sparingly because they are kind of mysteries. They're sort of like crime thrillers. So if you let a few years go by between your watches, then you'll forget about a lot of the little nuances or the details of the plot. And I love the first movie, but I actually think it took until the second movie for the franchise to really find its footing. I enjoy many of the sequels much more than the first movie. A lot to love though, obviously. I love Saw. It's a 4 out of 5 star movie for me. One thing that I especially love is that green ass tint. I love a green movie. I love a blue movie. And they didn't abandon that aesthetic until the 8th movie in Jigsaw. I love the drama thriller element of it too. The first Saw almost doesn't really feel like a horror movie. And of course, Carrie Elwes and Lee Whannell shine with their character tension as they build out the story. This one and my number 3 on this list are kind of interchangeable because I actually think that Saw is a higher quality movie than the one that I'm about to talk about right now. So Insidious comes at number 3. No matter how many times I rewatch this movie, it just doesn't lose its charm. That low budget, desaturated colors, wide lens, those red ass title credits, just a film that is absolutely dripping in style, but in such a subtle way. That is until you get into the further. And they manage to completely transport you just with some different camera angles, some fog, and some good creepy actors. That's like real old school filmmaking, and they just had to get so creative with that because with Insidious, you know, the budget was like $1.5 million. Not to mention the chemistry of the whole family is so wonderful. I love them so much. The stakes actually feel pretty high with the children in the movie as well because I think their acting is great. It also preys on some pretty primal childhood fears, like the moment where Foster is scared of Dalton, who's in the room across from him, and so he gets up and he shuts the door and then he runs back to bed really quick. Makes me kind of feel like a kid again watching it. I had a crippling fear of the dark as a child. But that movie popped off for a reason, you already know. So moving on to my number 2, that would be Malignant. Malignant has to be here. I thought about how there is a slight depreciation of the movie on the second watch because the shock value's kind of gone. But regardless, it's one of the most unique movies made in the last decade. It's so weird. We can only beat this dead horse so many times, but I will continue to pull it out along with my baseball bat. The jail scene should be played on a loop in the Louvre. On a loop in the Louvre. On a loop in the Louvre. Also, Maddie and I are both adopted icons. Somebody posted that clip on Twitter the other day and just reminded me just how campy the movie is. I also rewatched it about a month ago to prep for this video. So fucking funny, dude. So funny. Anyways, now it's no longer a surprise what my number 1 choice would be. That would be Insidious 2. Maybe this is my strangest choice at number 1, I know. I never get tired of this movie and in fact prefer it to the first one. It doesn't have the same sort of impermeable atmosphere of dread, but they kind of remove that in favor of some campiness, and I obviously really enjoy that because I love Malignant. Parker Crane is also my favorite villain of the franchise because he is not a demon, but a person with a very mysterious background that is slowly unraveled. I kind of find the demons to be the least rewatchable thing about the franchise, sans the man who can't breathe, because I still find him disgusting. So the one story about the human serial killer is the one that really does it for me. Michelle Crane is also obviously such an icon. I feel like she doesn't get enough love for being one of the worst mothers in horror history. I also love how they expand the possibilities of the further and they kind of play with the physics of it. It's just a fun movie to me, and I really don't have anything else to offer about that. I think I'm truly done here. If you made it this far, well done, my little student, my little maggot, my little demon. Let's think of a secret joke to put in the comments that only we know. Oh my god, you should tell me that you like my hat. That'll be so confusing to the other people in the the comments, but you and I will know what it means. And yes, you probably noticed the names scrolling on screen. These are my wonderful, wonderful patrons. You could also consider them as advisors to your unholy ruler. I really value their input on the channel. The Patreon is where you join if you want to contribute to keeping the lights on at Haunted Hippie Studios. But I also post a ton of bonus content, at least 4 to 6 bonus videos every single month, plus all the copyrighted watch-alongs that can't stay up on YouTube. I also post behind the scenes videos every once in a while where I talk about the equipment that I'm getting, I talk about upcoming content, and I get your input on it. So if that sounds good to you, that is listed down below, but you can also find all my social media, like my Instagram. That is also where I post some behind the scenes stuff, but I just kind of let you know what I'm working on. So, you know, I'll post little pictures of me at my computer typing away at my James Wan deep dive. But before you go, let me know the most interesting thing that you learned today, or tell me your ranking of James Wan's films. I'm so curious to see how other people rank his earlier work because there's just some weird stuff in there. Also, along with how you would rank his action films. You know, how do you feel about James Wan, the action director? More than anything, I just hope that you enjoyed this video and that I catch you in the next one. Bye!